All right, so we're joined via Zoom by independent economic and socio-political commentators to unpack the expectation of the budget speech by Minister Enoch Godongwana on Wednesday. A very good afternoon, Bongani Mahlangu. Thank you for your time here on the SABC.
Well, good afternoon to you and thanks for the invitation.
So obviously, the finance minister is going to have to strike a balance between the national spending priorities versus the limited resources allocated to the National Treasury. In view of this, what are your expectations ahead of the 2023 budget speech on Wednesday?
Okay, no, thanks. Also, just to give some context to it, is that we must remember that this is the last budget of the sixth administration. And when the sixth administration took over power, they embarked on fiscal consolidation, where it's austerity, reduction of expenditure, in order to close the budget deficit. And then now that is what has resulted even into public servants complaining and also infrastructure dilapidating and collapsing. But then when it comes to the expenditure priorities going into this year, the year of the rent seeker, the president has already outlined certain priorities such as load shedding, ensuring that there's energy security, unemployment, the rising cost of living, of which should also speak to the public servants, and also fighting crime and corruption. So now also then, with that being said, even in the midterm budget policy statement by Treasury, there were issues that were raised around the same things, which was energy security, creating buffers, and also the reduction of ensuring that there is proper maintenance or management of short-term spending by the state. So now all those things will find then expression in the budget that we are going to see now. But then, as I said, this will be a service. This will be a service budget. This budget must be responsive and reflective of the challenges of South Africans. And also this budget must also take into account that it's the last budget going into elections. So I'm confident somehow that a lot of people that have been raising a lot of issues with regards to demands to expenditure might find some satisfaction in this budget.
All right, so let's get into what some of those demands might look like, given the precarious economic situation. There's questions about which areas the minister should be allocating more funds, which areas are likely to receive budget cuts, and what that impact is going to have, given the socioeconomic conditions in South Africa. Let's look at some of them. We have to look at South Africa's debt, whether the accurate projections about the fiscal debt. There's the energy complex issue. There's the growing government wage bill. Unions unlikely, as we heard, given the strike that's set to also begin on Wednesday, really accepting the state's plan. And then obviously the risk of SOEs at large. Let's unpack that.
Okay, fine. So when we look at the fiscal or public debt that occurs in this country, it occurs mainly because of government borrowing for transfer payments in order to widen the social safety net. So the expenditure in that space does not really generate revenue for the state. And this is something that even Treasury has highlighted before in the MTBPS. So now it's always a question of revenue versus non-interest expenditure. So if you're going to go out as what our government has been doing into the domestic or foreign financial markets in order to mobilize resources in terms of loans, what are you doing that for? So our government has been doing it just for consumption expenditure. So the debt in itself, or the debt in general, is not an issue. What is an issue is that what do you then get debt for? For instance, if you look into Japan, for instance, that has a higher debt to GDP ratio than South Africa. You find that the economy of Japan is in the G8. It's a very strong economy. Why? Because the debt that they've got themselves into stimulates economic growth. The debt that they've got themselves speaks to infrastructure development. And we know that, for instance, in South Africa, every R1 spent on infrastructure, if you look at the multiplier, will get you about, on average, 2.5, which means it's R2.50. But since 2008, there hasn't been adequate expenditure in gross fixed capital formation, of which assists the economy to grow, assists in the creation of employment, assists in government generating revenue, which then would be reprioritized for other areas like increasing the government wage bill, paying workers accordingly, and so forth. And if you look into South Africa today, you have more people on social welfare than you have employed. So the few that are employed are really experiencing a downward pressure, and you cannot have that sustainable. So if the country were then to go and then get themselves into debt like there is now, but then use that money to grow the economy, then the debt issue just falls away. So then that is a priority area. Then I go back to infrastructure. Even infrastructure, South Africa needs to be adequately resourced in order to start its business, and then we generate the necessary yield from that department as led by Professor Spuka. Because as I said, since 2008, the gross capital formation in this country has been going down. Our infrastructure is dilapidating, is not being rehabilitated. There is inadequate construction of infrastructure. And we know that infrastructure is critical, more especially economic and social infrastructure, if you want to grow the economy, because everything boils down to growing the economy. You cannot want to resolve certain issues in an economy that is not growing. So now, if you want to pay social relief, stress grants, and so forth, you need the economy to grow. If we're speaking about the rising cost of living, you need the economy to grow. If we're speaking to the public debt crisis, you need the economy to grow. So the South African economy is not growing at an adequate pace in order to speak to all these things. Also, you have an issue with the public labor force, the very same people that want to embark on strikes. So I will give you some background. In 1979, for China to grow at a rapid rate that we have seen, it was not necessarily because of infrastructure investment, which was a secondary expenditure. But what was primary, what they started with was the professionalization and ensuring that there is capacity and competence in their public labor force. And then that later on, then they started investing in infrastructure. So in South Africa, you have a public labor force that is not professionalized, that is not properly capacitated, that is not properly resourced, that is not necessarily patriotic, and demonstrates low productivity levels, of which is what unions don't want to speak about. On average, it is below 50%. So I'm telling you, if government can then move from podium rhetorics and actually invest in that space, you will see then a government that is highly productive and that also has positive returns to our economy. And that is also not being done. And then the infrastructure one is not being done, along with other investment expenditure is not being done. But then when you look into the policies of the state, we have adequate policies, they're not being done. So as I said, the president spoke about crime and corruption.
Yep.
What is being done about that? Because it also cripples the ability of the state and also wastes the resources of the state. Can't you find that the Auditor General from municipal level up until national level, there are always findings of multi-billion rands, wasteful expenditure, irregular, and so forth. When we speak about unemployment, currently our government has embarked on a very expensive mass employment initiatives that do not speak to full employment, and then that does not give income security to these people. So up until something is really done by stimulating the economy, you will still find government spending multi-billions on such projects, but such projects, the yield of it are very low. So those should be then the priorities of the state. When we talk about the rising cost of living, remember the passenger rail system in South Africa has almost collapsed, meaning people were forced to move to taxis, which are very expensive and volatile in terms of prices, because they always adjust their prices according to oil prices. Now, a lot of South Africans were reliant on that public transport system, but then you need to invest money, which also speaks to infrastructure, in bringing that system back to its former glory and improving it according to the economic reconstruction and recovery plan, which will relieve then the expenditure of our households, and they would have some surplus that will enable them to build household buffers to the rising inflation. We are not seeing that happening. So those should be priorities of the finance minister as they were outlined in the State of the Nation address.
Bongani, we're going to see, all eyes will be on the finance minister to see how that's translated. We're in a very precarious situation in the country as we head into elections come 2024. So priorities are also going to shift. Numbers are also needed from the electorate. So obviously there's strategies in place to appease those as well. I think in conclusion, I want to move the conversation to a macro level, just in the interest of time. But I know that the conversation conversation will continue. There's a looming global recession that's also set to unfold. And just given South Africa's economic situation, how do you think we're going to fare in that? What do you think are going to be some of the biggest issues that we face as a country during this pending time?
No, that's very interesting, because if you look into even the Reserve Bank as they've been adjusting the repo rate upwards, most of the variables that they consider are your exogenous variables, things that are happening globally. So we are talking there about the slowdown in the global economy, the volatility in the global economy, global inflation. We are talking about China that had closed it.
All right, Bongani Mahlangu is an independent economic and socio-political commentator. He was unpacking what the expectations are ahead of the Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana's budget speech that is set to commence on the 22nd of February 2023. Thank you for his time. Unfortunately, we lost that connection there.